All right. Well, my name is Stephanie Garner, and I'm the program coordinator at Down Syndrome Indiana, and I really appreciate all of you guys joining us today. I apologize for the child in the background. My husband's just getting home from work, so soon I will be in another room, but she never stops talking. So Dr. Holsapple, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really excited that you are willing to take time out of your busy evening to be here with us and answer some questions. There are a couple things that I want to go over before we get started. First and foremost, this is an incredibly hard time for each and every one of us, whether you are the parent of a child who receives special education services, the parent of a typically developing child, a teacher, a physical therapist, a service provider, or an administrator at the school. We're all under a lot of stress and we're all doing the very best that we can. So we want to make sure that we give each other a lot of grace this evening. We currently have about 30 people on this call, and I guarantee we have about 30 different opinions on exactly how things should be handled. So I want to be respectful of those differences of opinions. And I also want to acknowledge that we're all doing the best we can. Schools are doing the best they can to keep our kids safe. The state is doing the best they can to keep our kids safe, and we're all trying to make the best decision that we can. And Dr. Holsapple is here to help get some of our questions answered, but I promise she's not going to have all the answers because nobody does. This is a very new and novel situation, and so we're all just gathering information and kind of making decisions as we can, and then adjusting and going from there. So Dr. Holsapple, thank you so much. So glad you're here joining us. We are going to, the format we're going to use tonight is I'm going to ask some questions that people have submitted. I'm going to present those to Dr. Holsapple, and then she'll answer those. If you guys have further questions or need clarifications, you're welcome to type questions in the chat bar. We're going to be kind of going through those as well. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have plenty of time that you can ask her questions, unmute yourself, and ask her some direct questions if you need to. So do you want me to go straight into the questions, ma'am, or do you have anything you want to say to start with?
I do. I want to acknowledge everyone on here. Like you mentioned, when the COVID hit, schools were not prepared for the long term of e-learning. Typically, when e-learning was designed, it was for inclement weather, and the situation that families were put into, and when I say families, it's everyone, those who weren't able to work, those who have lost loved ones due to the COVID, those who have been quarantined or trying to balance work if you were one of the essential workers, and then having children at home, and then trying to do e-learning online. So I like to start by thanking everyone for the job that everyone's doing. We are all doing the best we can. And you are right, Stephanie. I don't have all the answers. And it seems like every day something is changing. Just this week, there's been some schools around Indianapolis that announced their delay in starting school. So families who thought they had a plan in place when school was going to start now has to come up with something different for maybe 2 to 3 weeks. There are some schools who are looking at alternate days of attendance for especially high schools because they have such large student bodies that there's no way to socially distance. I think today I heard just another county announce that they were going to be mask mandated. So I think right now in Indiana, we have 8 counties possibly that are mask mandated. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's on here, because this is a challenge for all of us. So we can start the questions, and if I don't have the answer, I'll be happy to get the answer, share it with you, Stephanie, and then you could share it out with your organization.
Perfect. Well, thank you. So our first question actually does relate to mask wearing. So our schools have such a wide range of policies on what they're requiring, from masks are recommended but not required in some districts to the districts that are doing a hybrid masks are required, but exemptions will be made if your child can't or won't wear a mask. You just have to have a note from a doctor. To kind of the far extreme of masks are required for everyone with absolutely no exceptions. And that seems to be the one that is most concerning for our families. So if for our families who are in a district and they're saying masks are required, absolutely no exceptions, what options do those families have if schools are telling them, if you can't wear a mask, you have to do e-learning? And the reality is that some of those e-learning services weren't the best, and parents are really hesitant to try that option.
Right. I do know, with many of our students that can have sensory issues, that wearing a cloth mask is just not acceptable. And one of the things that my office tried to do is get information. So a child who may not be able to wear a cloth mask might be able to wear a face shield, and we all know as parents, every child is different, and we try to put that guidance out there. I do know I have heard from parents and in fact some of my staff who have children in various schools have gotten the reentry letter, and they were told that it's a mask or you have to do e-learning. So what I would suggest is, if you have a child who cannot wear the mask and your school is mandating the child have a mask on, you really need to be requesting a case conference to see if the case conference, the parent at the table, and the school can come to a consensus on what would be allowable for the child to wear while at the school. I've read many things is that if the child has it on while walking in the hall, but then they go to the classroom and all the desks are facing one way, then the child can take the mask off. Um, if if you have a child that really needs to observe facial expressions, they have masks that have a clear shield area in the middle. Some of the families I've talked to, they are looking into those, but I also know schools are purchasing those, especially for their therapists, students who are deaf and hard of hearing, students on the autism spectrum, and speech therapists who really need for their students to be able to see their mouths, see the facial expressions, those key points that is very instrumental in the development of children. But I would suggest the case conference. And to be honest, if you request the case conference and the school has you come in or do a virtual case conference and they just say, well, we just don't know, please don't interpret that as they're not willing to work with you, because they could truly just not know at the moment on what's the best avenue. Um, I've read that it's a certain age. So if we're talking our preschool children, that go to a developmental preschool or even a regular preschool, it may be very difficult for them to keep that mask on just due to their age. So those are all things that we have to consider when when schools are reopening. Um, I've seen from different schools their reentry plans that if you do have something from a doctor that says maybe your child has asthma or breathing problems, or if they can't physically take that mask off, then there could be an allowance that that child not wear the mask for health purposes for the child and safety. I think the ultimate goal that the schools are wanting is that s- all students are safe, and in turn they want the teachers, the staff who are working with our children to also be safe. So
Yeah, absolutely. So for our students that would do better with teachers and therapists who are wearing either the see-through mask or the shield because they need to see that expression,
mhm.
we request that of our school. Like, if I know my student is going to do better with that, can I let the school know, and should they make that accommodation for us?
Yes, the list that my office provided, it was several vendors that are offering these up, from the clear mask to the face shields, I'm sorry, to the clear mask with a section that's clear, to different types of cloth mask. We may have children who have hearing aids or cochlear implants that they cannot put the mask behind their ears, so they would benefit more possibly from a face shield. Or just this weekend I was in Rockville and I was in a store and they were selling headbands, so like headbands girls wear, but they had buttons on them, so you could hook your straps of your mask onto the buttons on the headband. So that could be an avenue, for students who have hearing aids or cochlear implants, or don't like the feel of the mask behind their ears. But schools were able to apply for the CARES money from the federal government. Schools also can utilize their Part B money that they get from my office. And if they bill for Medicaid, they are able also to utilize that money to purchase an altered, is what we're kind of calling them, altered mask to help our students and for the teachers as well. So if you have a child that needs to be able to see those facial expressions, then that teacher needs to be able to show his or her face to the students.
Excellent. So have we considered, from like a state level, having some sort of just a blanket mandate on, like, every school is going to have these requirements for mask wearing, because there is such a huge disparity amongst different districts. And I know that's a big source of frustration for parents that, a neighboring district is um, doing things a little bit differently than my
Right,
district, and I like that better. Or
right. What makes it difficult in
Oh, sí,
I
Nancy Hospital, algo
I say difficult, but I shouldn't use that word. Um,
así.
Indiana is a
Nancy
local control state. So in that, it is up to each school district to make their own policy and their decisions along those lines. So the state sent out a survey to superintendents, and they had to request how many, they have them in like small to medium large that would fit us, mask for students. Indiana had 2.2 million masks to distribute to LEAs. So if a family doesn't have access to a mask and they want their child to wear one while at school, then when school starts, if that child goes to on-site class, then the school would issue them or provide to them the mask. They have spent, I know, a lot of their CARES money ordering hand sanitizer and cleaning supplies, because the goal is all of our buses, our playground equipment, things in the school that children access, that they keep them sanitized and have access to the hand sanitizer whenever they need to. But it is a challenge if school district A has the opportunity to offer a lot, and then District B, who could be the neighboring district, but for whatever reason their enrollment is down, so they don't have the finances, and maybe they aren't offering everything that School District A could. It becomes a challenge for families, especially now that we have open enrollment, that you could send your child to a neighboring district if a parent would choose to do that.
Yeah, thank you. So I have some toileting questions now. I know that this probably doesn't affect a lot of folks, but it might affect more of us than you think. So we have some families that have had some interesting comments about toileting. One family said that their district, their child's special education classroom has moved locations to a bigger classroom to be able to better accommodate social distancing, but the classroom that they moved to doesn't have a private restroom. And so the school's accommodation for that is that they have partitioned off a corner of the classroom for diaper changing. Mom and dad are really uncomfortable with that. They feel like that's a violation of privacy. So they're just wondering what your thoughts are on that. And just FYI, we have other districts who have done this pre-COVID as well, who have diaper changing in the classroom with just partitions.
Mm-hmm. I know, I know that does happen. And in the times that I've had conversations with school, sorry if you can hear my dog barking, is that if there's a classroom, excuse me, one.
Well, thank you all for being here and joining us. I really am grateful to see such a large crowd. So thank you.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Gotta love virtual. It is what it is.
Exactly.
So I have, had conversations with schools where there have been situations where the classroom teacher would have a changing area in her classroom. And when questioned about that, they'll say, well, for safety purposes, sometimes there is not an additional adult in the classroom. So if the teacher needed to do a changing, he or she wasn't able to leave. But that's very rare that, I come across those, because typically, if you have a child that still has to have assistance on the either going to the restroom, maybe they can't access the toilet by themselves or get their pants down, whatever the case may be. Typically, there's an instructional assistant or the teacher that is going with them. I think in situations like this, it's my understanding that schools have the area set aside for the nurse that will handle your daily nosebleed, need a Band-Aid, fell down on the playground, to a student that comes in and during class starts running a fever, and just to be cautious, they quarantine that child in a separate clinic nurses area. And to me, the parents should have the conversation with the school. And even though the school is saying, you know, we expanded the classroom, we changed it so we could implement that social distancing, the parents could still say, I don't feel comfortable and I don't want my child changed in the classroom. So what are my other options? And the school could offer up the nurses area if that's a doable thing. I know some schools in the elementaries have actually had um, like changing areas within a restroom, especially for our preschool age kids who still are not potty trained and they may have to access, you know, a changing table or something like that. I have seen those in restrooms. So that's private. You are taking the child into the restroom and assisting them in that situation. So the one thing parents have to remember is it's your children. So when you go into a school and you go into a case conference, you know, the school is doing the best they can as educators, and they're offering up options to you. As a parent, it is your decision on what the final outcome is. Um, I know schools and families should work together because, you know, children with disabilities can stay in school until the age of 22, and you don't want to have a non-working relationship with your school. But my past experience, and just in case you're wondering, I do have 34 years of special education under my belt. I started out as a classroom teacher, and then I was a local special ed director for 15 years. And I can't tell you how many case conferences I have sat in since I started in the 80s. And the one thing that I would try to reiterate with my families, you're the parent. This is your child. You know, you know your child the best. And if you tell us this doesn't make you feel comfortable, or this isn't a good fit for my child, then you as a parent have to be the main advocate for your child until your child is able to advocate for themselves. So
Absolutely. We have another family that was told by their school that if their child has an accident during the day, that mom or dad will have to come in and change that student because the school doesn't do bodily fluids anymore because of COVID restrictions. I feel like that shouldn't be a thing, but
I've not heard that, and I'd love for you to tell me who the district is.
I would be happy to talk to you more about it.
Okay, so we can have this conversation, but
Yeah.
you know, to me, that's no different than if a child is G-tube fed, has to have a cath, gets a nosebleed. Those are all bodily fluids that you would come in contact with. And, you know, if anything, if the nurse or the health aide feels uncomfortable, um, let them double glove up, you know, or if they have access to like the gown that nurses and medical people wear, have access to that. But to say that, to tell parents that they have to come in and change their child because they've had an accident, I I can't understand how that could even occur. It's students with disabilities, and parents have the rights, and what's in that child's IEP is a legal binding document. So,
Okay, beautiful. I thought so, but I figured I'd go to the top and hear it from the expert. All right, so let's talk instructional assistants. So I know that a lot of schools struggle to get appropriate numbers of instructional assistants in the best of times. It's hard to keep those positions filled, and we're anticipating that's probably going to be a little harder with COVID. And so we've got a lot of students or a lot of parents who are worried about the levels of support that their kids are going to get in the classroom. So just to give you a couple of examples, like if you have a student who maybe is spending a lot of time in the general education classroom and doesn't necessarily have a one-on-one written into their IEP, but historically the school has provided an aid for that student when they are in the general education classroom, just to help support them. Should we expect that same level of support if our student needs that level of support? Is COVID a good reason for the school to say, oh, it's too many adults, we have to cut back on the people in the classroom, so we need to pull all the special education instructional assistants out, and your student will no longer be able to have an aide with them or helping them?
I think one, we have such a shortage in Indiana of special education teachers, therapists, and I'm afraid, and it's not because schools are laying off people. It's that some of our instructional assistants, our teachers, our therapists, if they are of an age or they're exposed to someone in their home who might be at risk, that they are choosing to not go back to work. I think what schools are trying to do, if they're saying that that instructional assistant won't be in that room, if they're trying to do the social distance with the classroom, depending on, the number of kids within that classroom. But if the student has supports and it's written in the IEP, and the school says, well, we're not going to have that instructional assistant within that classroom anymore, then it's the parents' right to ask, what kind of supports are we putting in place instead of, if that person is not going to be accessible. I have heard all kinds of plans from more the elementary. The kids are staying in one classroom and then the teachers are rotating in. And I've heard where if students, say if it's a student with a disability and they need more one-on-one support, then that teacher could come into the classroom in addition to the gen ed teacher and offer the direct support that way. Or they could take them to a room where there aren't a lot of kids, so they're able to do the social distancing in that way. But if your school tells you that we just don't have the instructional assistants, it's not that they're trying to not offer the support. It could be that there's just not the people that are looking for employment. Today, on the Department of Ed, we have a job bank, and schools can post positions. And as of today, there were 155 positions open in the state of Indiana. Now that entails speech therapists, classroom teachers, school psychologists, regular therapists in there. So Indiana has a huge, huge shortage of people to work with students with disabilities.
Okay, so we have a lot of parents that are also worried about their child getting their agreed upon minutes of inclusive education. So like specifically, if you have a student who maybe does a 50-50 split, so half the day in a special education environment, half the day in general education, parents are worried that schools are going to be saying, well, we can't do that general education time because we are trying to socially distance, we're trying to limit transitions, so we're going to keep your student in the special education room to get all of their services, so we're not doing all of those transitions. And, you know, like maybe that would initially, it would be in violation of that child's IEP. It would, but can schools force parents to change that IEP to say we can no longer allow your student to be in that general education environment because of COVID restrictions? So we're going to need to change that in your IEP.
Right. No, it can't be changed without a case conference decision, and parents have to be in agreement. But schools also are monitored by what we refer to as LRE code. So if the goal is to always have students in the gen ed classroom as much as they can either sustain it, or they can handle the curriculum, or if they're in there and they need additional supports. The ultimate goal should be students are in gen ed classrooms. So if a school comes back and says, because of social distancing, we can't allow your child to be in gen ed classes, well, one, that would violate the child's IEP if their time shows that they are to be in gen ed classes. And two, once the school submits their, like my office has to track the LRE, and then the federal government tracks states for their LRE. So if a school came back and showed that they had a higher percentage of kids in self-contained or homebound situations like that, then they would have the accountability to my office. But the very first thing is, if a school came back, the parents should say, my child's IEP shows that they are in gen ed class 50% of the time, 60, 80, 100% of the time, then that's what should be implemented. You're going to have kids in buildings in the hallways, if they're going to the restroom, or if lunch is a grab and go, depending on what the school, sets up to recess. So kids are going to be passing each other, and we can't say we're going to social distance only with kids with disabilities. No, if we're going to social distance, we're social distancing all students. So that cannot be a reason, and it would be in violation of the IEP. And if that happened, and if the parent felt like they didn't get any resolve, they have the right to file a complaint, mediation, or a due process. I think oftentimes parents don't want to get to that very end because of the legalities that's tied with it. But I think oftentimes, a parent can file a complaint, and my complaint investigators have to look at that. They review the child's IEP, and if they find that the school's in violation, then they have guidance that they give to the schools that they have to make corrective actions to.
And just from my 2 cents for everybody that's on this call, if you are struggling with that with your school and are hesitant to go to that next step, maybe you could show them the recording of this and direct them to this exact time spot on the recording, and let them hear Dr. Holsapple's answer, and maybe that would help them to see the light without having to go to that extreme. So also in line with those questions. So if parents have an IEP where services are pushed in, OT, PT, speech are pushed into the classroom, again, it sounds like you're saying that should continue. Schools can't necessarily use that as an excuse to change the way that it's written that IEP is written, right? Even pertaining to services.
Right. If anything in the IEP is changed, it has to be a revision either with a case conference or without a case conference, but that's dependent on the parent's decision. I think schools, when you talk about push in, I think schools are going to try to figure out how they can continue with those supports to our students. And, the goal is always to keep our kids in gen ed classes. And if they need the related services to help address the disability that the child has in order for them to be able to gain skills, knowledge, adaptation to the classrooms, socialization, whatever that therapist is working with that child on, they're going to have to figure out if we're not doing it in the classroom and the parent says, okay, there's a class of 26 kids, it's really crowded, but I want my child to continue with OT. Then it could be that, the OT, I've seen OTs take the kids to the back of the room. I've seen OTs take the kids in the hall. I've seen OTs take the kids down to a therapy room, depending on what they're working on. If it's fine motor skills and they're working on pencil grip or handwriting, then yes, that could be worked on within the classroom. If you have therapists who are concerned about their own health and they're giving the classroom teacher um, uh, skills or guidance that classroom teacher could implement. Maybe the teacher is working with the child on the tripod hold of the pencil, and she just continuously reminds the child on how to correctly hold the pencil. Those are things that can be implemented within the classroom. I think typically your PT is taken out of the classroom because it tends to be more of the gross motor that the physical therapists are working on, and then your speech therapist. Um, I see more push in our preschools than I do in grade level classes because they try to work directly with the child to address the speech deficit that they are working on so they can improve upon and be able to obtain the formation or the enunciation or even language development. Speech therapists work a lot with kids on language development, and those are typically pulled out. Now, I have seen in some of the school conversations that the speech therapists, especially, the schools are buying the, I call them the sneeze guards, the clear plexiglass shields to be able to offer like a barrier. So then when the child's in the therapy room, maybe the speech therapist doesn't wear the mask then, so then the child could see the facial, but then they've got that clear plexiglass between them as a protective shield, not only for the teacher, but also for the child as well, because we have lots of children who have autoimmune and severe health needs that could easily expose them and be detrimental to our children.
So does all of this pertain also to our older students who might be doing jobs around school or vocational activities, maybe helping deliver mail or, having specific jobs at the library or the office?
Right.
Those still
That's right. Those things may be tough because it may not be that the school is saying you can't. It could be the areas that they used to go to. Maybe they went to the library. Maybe they went to the grocery store. And I know when I was at Old National Trail, we had a lot of our kids in the older age group. They were actually out in the community They came to school for half a day, and then they worked on their job skills the other half of the day. So thinking of some of those facilities now, I'm not even sure, if they're all of them are even open, or if they're open, um, are they allowing in the sense of volunteers to come in? And I don't know, because I haven't wandered away from home too often to go to a lot of the places. Um, I don't even know when they'll be open. I know libraries, it's my understanding, some of them are still doing curb service. You could pick out your books and you go and they hand them to you in the bag and then you drop them off through the slot. So those things, and again, when school starts, families really just need to work with schools, because I think schools are trying to figure this out as well, especially with our students with disabilities, our high school kids, um, students on the autism spectrum who really, really thrive with schedules. And then, I'm hearing some schools are going to open, but with alternate days, and trying to work through those things with families and students, because it's going to be challenging in the sense that it's so different for everyone. And I've heard families tell me that their kids thrived doing the e-learning, doing the virtual, but what they missed out on was the socialization. They needed that social, um, the the socialization of working through groups, in the sense, having that contact with other kids. I mean, here we're all on Zoom and we can see each other, but it's so different, and so many of our kids have a hard time understanding not being able to see their friends. They're going to school, the schedule that they're so used to. So that becomes a challenge for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, talking a little bit more about e-learning, in the spring, there was such a huge disparity between services that were provided between one district and another. And I know just families on this call alone, we've had such a wide range of experiences, some really great and others really bad. And so I know that going into this fall, we've got a lot of families that are really nervous about potentially going to e-learning. And some of those families are even concerned enough that they're considering, rather than having to do subpar e-learning, like they're thinking about homeschooling their kids. So my question is, like, what guidance is the Department of Education, and specifically your office, offering to our districts on how to provide appropriate e-learning services? And is there kind of a bare minimum that we as parents should expect?
Well, when this hit us in the spring, and schools had such a short turnaround to try to get stuff virtually, the one big obstacle I heard from a lot of our districts was there were so many kids who did not even have devices or access to the internet. So districts were trying to be creative in putting a hotspot on a school bus and driving to an area so families could access the hotspot. It's my understanding a lot of kids did their assignments on their phones because that's the only device that they had. I think in this time frame, since the COVID has hit, I think schools have had better professional development in learning how to provide the education virtually. Um, I know schools have purchased a lot of devices with the CARES money and hotspots for families to make sure kids have that device in their hands. And the one thing that, I had conversations with families and school personnel that just because a school question or did a survey and the family said, yes, we have a device, meaning a laptop or a desktop. Well, you could also have 3 children in your home that has to do virtual learning. So one device doesn't quite work for 3 kids. So I think schools have, like I said, purchase more hotspots, purchase more devices. The families, when this first started, who said that they didn't have access to the internet or they just didn't feel comfortable with the internet, many of our schools sent home packets. Now, I also found out when packets were sent home, that didn't necessarily mean that accommodations were included. It was, here's your packets. If you're in 3rd grade, you pick it up when you pick up your lunch. And every packet was the same. I think teachers from that realize they have to put the accommodations or modifications if a child needs that into place. I think the schools, the teachers, have gotten more familiar with either Zoom, Google Classroom, Google Meet, Canvas. Those are all different types of platforms that I've heard different schools have used. And there's nothing that prohibits families either. So if I'm a parent and I have a child with a disability, and we have to log into Zoom or Google Classroom, and I'm not very familiar with it or how to do it, then the parent needs to reach out to that teacher. And you know what? That teacher probably had to learn as well as helping the families. So families should not feel like it's going to be trouble or burdensome, or that they just don't feel comfortable reaching out to the school. They need to, because if the parents don't understand or can't access, then the school's not going to know that they can't do that. And that's going to be a disservice for the child, because it's going to put the child further behind in getting their lessons done. I think schools have realized, and my office, Stephanie has put out documents on accommodations and modifications for virtual learning. We're getting ready to release information again about case conferences and making sure parents are invited. One of the things that I was able to do when this hit, and I'm going to continue when school starts, is the Ed Plan Connect. So, when this first hit, my children, my daughter's in college and my son's grown, but I had many sleepless nights because I would be going to sleep and I'd think, well, how can families, or how can we do that? And one of those in the middle of the night questions was, if we're still doing our case conferences, how can parents sign the documents? And, schools were in the process of almost completing the initial evaluation, and schools can't proceed with an initial evaluation without parents' written consent for the initial. Now, if you're doing a case conference revision or, just a regular case conference, the parent doesn't always have to sign those, because we're putting in place pretty much the supports and accommodations that were previously there. So I reached out to our vendor who does the IEP online. And in talking with them, they said, yes, we have an access to turning on, and parents, if they have the parents' email in the system, the parents would get an email alert that they were getting a document, and it was the child's IEP. Now, um, those documents, those types of things, we're going to continue when school starts. So if parents, even if they send their child to school, but the parents don't feel comfortable going on site, they can still do their case conference virtually and then have the IEP sent to them electronically. And they could have the copy of that as well. But, we were trying to think, how can we get this to families? How can we get families? Um, and we did it in the different languages we were talking about, of translation, making sure families understand what they're signing, and they could get a copy. They could either save it, or if they have access at home to print it off, they would have that as well. But talking through the virtual, there were so many what ifs, and I know students did not get the services that they needed. I think once school reopens and schools start looking at the level of functioning of skills of students, if they've lost skills or gained skills, they will know when they're looking at their IEP goals what we need to do. If a student needs what we are referring to them as recovery services. So if your child got speech therapy and you saw a decline in their skills, then when schools reconvene, if you as a parent decide to send your child to school or do virtual, then they would have what we call our recovery services, hoping to try to implement those skills that the child um, actually lost over the 5 months. I know some schools were talking about like a jump start first couple weeks, but so many schools are now delaying the start of school. I'm not even sure when that's occurring. Um, there's been conversations, not in Indiana, but in other states, that they were going to have students with disabilities come first, come back to school first. So it's almost like a jump start program to try to help recoup some of the skills. Now, that was being said in some of the states. And of course, in conversations with the state directors, they were still trying to figure out all of that, trying to figure out how they could do that. So just know that the e-learning in the beginning was not the best, but it may not have been the best for all kids. So
Yeah. Yeah, it was definitely it was a challenge for everybody to make that work. Um, so going into the fall, for our families that do choose e-learning as an option for them, how will therapy services be offered? Should we expect those to be like one-on-one via Zoom for that child to get the hours that are written into their IEP, like via Zoom or Google Class, some way that you can see the therapist and work actually one-on-one? And the same thing for even working with a special education teacher. Is that something our parents should be requesting? Like, I want some FaceTime with my special education teacher every day, or an instructional assistant to help provide some of that education.
right. I was in a meeting last week, and one of the things that was being discussed was that they were going to set up the classroom so kids could go on site. The classroom teacher was going to be Zoomed. So if students or families were choosing to have the child participate virtually, they could still see what the teacher was doing, you know, participating in that sense, but yet not being in the classroom. um, the same with therapists. You know, if they're doing a Zoom or Google Classroom, and the therapist has maybe 3 students that they're working with, and one of them is a child who's doing it virtually, maybe they could participate by Zoom. I know some families, when this first hit, it was just so overwhelming. And even though schools may have sent stuff home, it was just hard to implement. You know, if here's exercises you could do for range of motion. Well, I've I'm a parent and I know what that's like, trying to get your child to focus and do something what you were calling like school when they're at home and you know, the weather's nice and they want to go outside or watch TV, whatever the case may be. So I think schools are trying to provide alternative ways in order for those kids who are doing it virtually can still participate and be a part of the classroom. But I will tell you, it's, you know, different across the state. Um, some schools are hiring a person to be the virtual teacher, maybe making sure kids are checking in for attendance. You know, if they have homework questions, maybe that person could reach out to that classroom teacher. However, they are going to try and set that up, because it is a parent's decision, you know, if they want their child to go to school or attend virtually.
Yeah, definitely. So what about for our Spanish speaking families that maybe aren't real comfortable with English? How can we support those families during e-learning? Um, are we going to have interpreters available who can make sure that mom and dad understand the material and are getting the information that they need to be able to help their kids at home?
Hmm. That's a great question. And that's a question I need to ask our EL department to see if, um, I know, you know, in special education, we're always trying to make sure we have accessibility, closed caption for our families. But if we have Spanish speaking families and they're not fluent in English, well, closed caption in English isn't going to work. So let me check that out. Let me find out what our EL department is um, proposing to the field, and I can get back with you on that.
Yeah, that would be great. And then I can share it with all of our families who are on here tonight. Um, let's see. Um, so if we have families who are who have who aren't sure they want to do the e-learning option, like I had mentioned earlier, a lot of our families are considering doing homeschooling instead of e-learning. So can you talk to us about if we choose that option, how does that affect our child's IEP? What does that look like?
Sure. So if a parent decides to withdraw their child, because you have to withdraw their child to do homeschooling, and in Indiana, homeschooling is considered private school. So what would happen is the case conference would meet with the families. They would still offer the IEP. And at that time, the families would say, I'm withdrawing my child to homeschool. Well, then the IEP turns into a service plan. And parents have the choice of taking the service plan. You get services, but not like you would with an IEP. And also with the homeschooling, you know, parents are responsible for getting the curriculum, for providing the instruction, and then implementing everything in place that would be typically done in a school. It would then fall on the responsibility of families to homeschool.
Excellent. And we've got a few more questions rolling in. Give me a second to read those. I have one question for you that you can answer while I'm catching up on questions in the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
If we have families that have more questions, because I know that we're not going to get everything answered this evening, or you're going to think of something 5 minutes after we log off this call, is there
Sure.
a way that families can get hold of, not necessarily you, but someone from your office to talk about any of these things?
Sure. Um, Indiana is the only state that has a representative from InSource, which is our state parent advocacy group. And Lisa Paddock actually sits in our Office of Special Ed. Her email is on our website, and there are also lots of documents that parents can access. If you go to the Office of Special Education, there's also a tab. So I like visuals. So there's a tab that just says parents. Parents can access that. And then within that, we have a copy of access to InSource, Article 7, um, just information for families. But Lisa Paddock, if parents felt more comfortable contacting her, she is a representative of InSource, and she works with so many of our parents, and InSource is across the state, so they have resources everywhere to support families. Or I take emails from parents. That doesn't bother me at all.
You are incredibly receptive to my email, so thank you.
I work for our students. I don't work for me. I work for our students with disabilities. And I want to make sure our kids are getting the best education they can. And sometimes in my past, administrators didn't always care for my answers, but it's the way it is. So
Yeah.
they can reach out to me too.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And just so you know, I found her email address on the State Department of Education website. So that's how I got you. All right. So we do have another question. So a lot of our districts are really specific in their guidelines. Like, we need you to let us know by this date whether you're going to be doing e-learning or in-person school, and you have to agree to do it for this time frame. What happens if we start, we'd start in person with our student, and then a few weeks in, we decide, oh, they won't wear a mask and we're not comfortable with this or whatever, and we want to move to e-learning? Is that an option, or can our district say, oh, nope, you chose in person, so you're stuck?
Right. I know that right there is actually being fluid right now, because one of the ladies that works for me, she had signed her child up and she was going to do e-learning. Well, then their email came back. She got an email back from the district that says, instead of for this semester, we're looking at it like 9 weeks, or it's going to be more fluid, because nobody knows what's going to happen. So if you start your child in a classroom and the mask isn't working, or say your district has high numbers of people test positive for COVID, or your county, the schools have to work with their county health departments. And for those who aren't on here, Marion County has been one of those very high numbered counties. And I think that's why the schools around Marion County are starting later. But if your county health department says our numbers are so high, schools need to shutter again, then that's going to happen. But as a parent, if you have all of those concerns, and when you go into a case conference, you need to say, if my child struggles with his mask or her mask, or we have someone in our family who's high risk, and if there are high numbers in our school, I need to be able to pull my child out and do virtual learning. Um, that's a conversation that needs to happen. And I know schools are trying to say you do online or you do on site. And I hate to say this because I think, some families, given, it could be that they send their child to school, and 2 to 3 weeks later, they're like, you don't have to go to school. You're just going to do virtual. Well, the school trying to track those children, that would be a challenge for the schools as well. So I think that's kind of why they're trying to say you either are this or that. But I think they also know that things are probably going to be fluid. But when you have your case conferences or call a case conference, just stress, I really want my child on site, but these factors could determine if I do e-learning. So what plan can we have in place if these factors occur that I could safely pull my child back out?
Excellent. And then we have a comment in the chat box that it feels like this is going to be a lot for teachers to handle for districts where maybe some students are doing e-learning while some are in the classroom full time. Like, how are teachers going to balance trying to do both e-learning for some of their students and in-person learning for other students?
Right. And possibly be parents themselves, because that's an occurrence. Um, it's one of the concerns that, as administrators, we have about the social emotional piece of our teachers and our students too. I think that's a key factor why we think kids need to be back in school, for the social emotional piece of it. But the teachers, and I'm afraid, Stephanie, when I looked today in the job bank and I saw 155 postings, I think educators, especially veteran educators, they're concerned for their own health. They're concerned on how they can balance all of that. And the only thing I can ask parents is, when you're working with your teachers, to have grace, because that teacher is trying to do what they feel like they're doing the best they can. Um, educators don't get into education for money, and special education people, we do not. My goal of why I went into special education is to try and make a difference in the life of a child with a disability. And I think that's the majority of our teachers. So when I've had conversations with teachers, they tell me, I've missed my kids. I want to see my kids. It was so hard. I heard from teachers when they had to go back into the buildings at the end of spring and clean out their classrooms or bag up their students' stuff so the parents could come get them. I had conversations with teachers who were crying because they missed that end of the year, that closure. I had a conversation with someone over the weekend who said, can you imagine trying to do your first day back virtually? Because you're getting to know your kids, you're setting your classroom rules, you're um, you know having your kids get to know each other, and it's going to be a challenge. And teachers are going to, I hope not get burnout, but it's going to be tough times for our educators. So when our families are talking with them or working with them, one, families have to be honest with our schools. And we had families tell us in the spring, because of everything shutting down, they lost their jobs. they were concerned about putting food on the table, not education. And they told some of our teachers, we just can't do it. I appreciate your offer, but we just can't do it. And unfortunately, our economy is opening back up. People are getting jobs, but there's still, a high percentage of unemployment in our state. And, our goal is to make sure our kids are fed and that they're safe and healthy in the mental and physical aspect as well. So,
Excellent. Well, that kind of leads me into then the next kind of question. So for our families that need to do e-learning because of health issues, or maybe are forced to do e-learning if our school district chooses that as their only option, what can we do for those families who are maybe both parents are working full time and they're really struggling to be able to be home and provide the support that their child needs? What are your recommendations? Like, what should mom or dad do to figure
well,
it out?
I think the one thing is if, they're doing e-learning, or maybe they are in the medical field, or they're in the essential field, and the way schedules are, sometimes parents see each other coming and going because of their work schedules. I think parents need to convey that to schools and say, from 8 o'clock till 11 o'clock, I'm sleeping because I just came off of a night shift and I can't work with my child at that time. So, be aware, my child may sign on and get on to the lessons, but if an assignment is due right then, they need to convey that to schools given their home situation. Um, I it would be very disheartening if I heard of schools who weren't willing to work with our families given those situations. Um, I know they're going to try and count attendance if children do virtual. They want kids to log on. They want that opportunity to try to educate the kids. But we have to, if there's a situation at home, we have to be aware of it because we can't fix what we don't know.
Excellent. Well, I think that that's just about covered all of our questions in the chat box. I don't know, Dr. Holsapple, how much more time you have available to spend with us. I know we went a little over our hour time frame, but I'm very grateful for all of your answers and just really helping us feel a little bit better about where things are going, and knowing that we have your support, I think is wonderful.
Right.
So thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate you asking me on. And I'll just end with thanking the parents again, because I know this is a tough decision for families to make. But also, try to remember that schools are trying to do the best they can, and work with your schools. If you feel like you're not having a good conversation with a building administrator, you need to reach out to your special ed director. And you can typically find those people on the school's website. And if you're in a big district or even a small district, that doesn't mean that special ed director always has the knowledge of what's going on in those buildings. So that would be a great go-to person. But make sure, when school resumes and you make the decision that you make for your child, it's the decision that you made based off of what's best for your child and what's best for your family. Other people may not agree with it or offer you comments, and that's not atypical, but You're the parents and you know what's best for your child. So,
And
and Stephanie, I'll get with our EL department and see what resources I can come up with, and I'll email those to you.
thank
And
you.
then
I
if you
really
have other
appreciate it.
questions after, you could either reach out to Lisa Paddock or myself, and then I'll try and get the answers for you.
Perfect. Thank you. And folks, I highly recommend if you are having issues and you need help, don't hesitate to find an educational advocate. Reach out to your in-source representative, reach out to Family Voices, the ARC of Indiana, About Special Kids. Talk to those folks. If you can't find somebody, call and talk to me. I don't know everybody, or I don't know everything, but I know a lot of people who know a lot of stuff. So I am happy to help as well. Just, reach out and ask questions. And I'm really grateful y'all were on here. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.